Imagine the sound that signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. It wasn't the roar of a bomb. It wasn't the wail of a siren. And it certainly wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of laughter. The loud, velvet, self-assured laughter of a man who had just heard the most ridiculous joke of his life. That man is Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of Greater Germany, head of the Luftwaffe. The year is 1940, and he has every reason to be amused. Europe lies at the Nazis' feet. France fell in just 6 weeks. Poland is destroyed. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped Dunkirk, leaving all their heavy equipment on the beaches. In the skies over Europe, there is no force capable of challenging the German Messerschmitts. And then, amidst this triumph, Göring is handed a newspaper with news from Washington. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt has gone before Congress and announced that the United States plans to produce 50,000 combat aircraft a year. 50,000. Göring, a World War I ace and art collector, leans back in his chair. He looks at his generals and starts laughing. He calls it a bluff, a fantasy, the ravings of a madman. In an interview, he drops a line that would become legendary. Americans, all they know how to make are refrigerators and razor blades. And the scariest part of that moment wasn't that Göring was arrogant. The scariest part was that he was right. In 1940, the idea that America could become the arsenal of democracy sounded like bad science fiction. Let's forget for a second what we know today. Forget the superpower with nuclear aircraft carriers. Look at the facts of that time through Göring's eyes. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 19th in the world in size. 19th. Right behind Portugal and just ahead of Bulgaria. While German panzer divisions were slicing through European borders, American soldiers on maneuvers in Louisiana were running through fields carrying wooden sticks instead of rifles. They lacked machine guns, so they shouted rat-a-tat to simulate firing. They lacked anti-tank guns, so they used plumbing pipes welded to wagon wheels. The situation was so pathetic that trucks drove around with signs reading tank taped to them because there were no actual tanks. Officers used bags of flour instead of grenades. This wasn't a superpowers army. This was a camping club armed with enthusiasm and rusty weapons from the First World War. The aviation, even worse. While the Luftwaffe already possessed thousands of advanced fighters and bombers tested in combat in Spain, the U.S. Army Air Corps consisted of a few hundred obsolete biplanes that would have fallen apart at the mere sight of a German Messerschmitt. And now, this President Roosevelt claims they will build 50,000 planes. In a country where the entire aviation industry assembled planes almost by hand, like expensive watches? In a country that still hadn't recovered from the Great Depression? Where a quarter of the population was unemployed, and factories stood with boarded-up windows. To Göring and the entire Nazi command, this didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like the hysteria of a frightened politician. They looked at the map, saw the oceans separating the continents, and felt absolutely safe. Göring was certain the war would be over long before America could build even a tenth of what was promised. He knew about the refrigerators. He knew about the cars. But he made one fatal mistake. He didn't understand what happens when a nation obsessed with mass production feels a threat to its existence. Göring's laughter in that office became the death knell for the Third Reich. He just couldn't hear it yet. But in Washington, in the Oval Office, there was no laughter. There was dead silence. Roosevelt understood he had pulled that number out of thin air. He had no plan. He had no factories. He had no men. He needed a miracle. And he knew only one man in America crazy enough to try and perform it. This man wasn't a politician, and he wasn't a general. He was exactly the kind of person the Nazis despised most, a simple immigrant who started out mopping floors. His name was William Knudsen, or as he was known on the shop floors of Detroit, Big Bill. If you had met him on the street in 1900, you would have walked right past him. He was a 20-year-old Danish immigrant who had just stepped off a boat in New York. He had $30 in his pocket. He barely spoke English. For the first few months, he slept on park benches and took any job he could find, from riveting in shipyards to sweeping floors. But Bill Knudsen had a talent, a genius talent for seeing how things should fit together. He didn't just work on machines, he felt their rhythm. 40 years later, this former immigrant sat in the president's chair at General Motors. He was one of the highest paid men in America. In 1940, his salary was $300,000 a year. In today's money, that's over $5.5 million. He had everything: power, money, respect. He was the king of Detroit. And then the phone rings from the White House. Roosevelt, an aristocrat from an old New York family, asks for a meeting with Knudsen, a man whose hands still remembered machine oil. The conversation was short. Roosevelt said, "Bill, I need you to run war production. I need you to rebuild the entire American industry." Anyone else in Knudsen's place would have laughed or politely declined. Quit as head of GM? For what? For government bureaucracy and endless committees? But Knudsen asked only one question. "Mr. President, is that an order?" Roosevelt nodded, and then Knudsen did something that seems unthinkable today. He went back to Detroit and resigned. He walked away from his millions. He walked away from bonuses and stock options. He moved to Washington to work for the U.S. government for a salary he set himself. $1 a year. This wasn't a PR stunt. Knudsen understood that if he took an army salary, he'd be accused of corruption. If he stayed on the GM payroll, he'd be accused of lobbying. So he became a volunteer, the most powerful volunteer in history. But when Knudsen arrived in Washington, he faced a problem scarier than German tanks. That problem was called politicians. Senators and generals thought production was simple. They assumed you just pass a law, allocate money, and factories would magically start spitting out tanks instead of toasters. They looked at car factories and said, "Hey, you have assembly lines. Just swap the car body for an airplane fuselage." Knudsen looked at them like they were idiots. He took a blueprint of a bomber, threw it on the table, and uttered a phrase that sobered everyone in the room. "Gentlemen, we cannot just weld wings onto a Chevrolet." He explained the difference. A car is a thing that drives on the ground. If its engine fails, it just coasts to the shoulder. If an engine fails on a plane, the pilot dies. In a car, a millimeter of error is acceptable. In an aircraft engine, an error the width of a human hair means catastrophe. Knudsen understood. To execute Roosevelt's insane plan of 50,000 planes, you couldn't just speed up existing aircraft plants. Their capacity wasn't enough for even a tenth of it. He needed to do something no one had ever done. He needed to force the automotive giants, Ford, Chrysler, GM, to learn how to make airplanes. It was like asking a baker to start performing heart surgery, and to do it on an industrial scale. Knudsen gathered the heads of all the car corporations in one room. These were tough men, competitors who had spent decades tearing at each other's throats for every percentage of the market. They hated each other. But Knudsen closed the door and said, "From today on, there is no competition. There is only one client, Uncle Sam. And if we don't pull this off, our next client will be Hitler." What happened in 1940 and 1941 is politely called a period of adjustment by historians. The engineers who worked there called it hell on earth. It was a forced marriage of two industries that spoke different languages. On one side, the aviators, perfectionists. They were used to building planes one by one. They would change blueprints 5 times a day because a pilot complained about vibration. On the other side, the guys from Detroit, the kings of the assembly line. Their philosophy was simple: freeze the design, make the dies, and stamp out 1,000,000 copies without asking questions. When the aviation engineers brought their blueprints to Chrysler and Ford, the auto mechanics held their heads in their hands. The aviators demanded tolerances that seemed insane. A car engine is a cast iron block that forgives mistakes. An aircraft engine is a complex mechanism of light alloys operating at temperature limits. Arguments erupted. Aircraft designers shouted, "You're killing the aerodynamics with your rough seams." Automakers replied, "You're killing production with your endless edits. If we change the tooling every Tuesday, we won't build a single plane before the turn of the century." The press began to hound Knudsen. "Where are your 50,000 planes?" A year passed. No results. Factories were dug up. Machines dismantled. Piles of trash and shouting men filled the workshops. It seemed the skeptics were right. America had bitten off more than it could chew. But Knudsen knew something the journalists didn't. He knew the rule of the learning curve. First, you spend months creating the tools. You don't see the product. You only see the costs. But once the tools are ready, the curve shoots vertically upward. And while Detroit argued about microns and rivets, on the other side of the world, history decided to hurry things up. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. On that Sunday morning, all debates ended. No one argued about costs anymore. No one complained about overtime. America received a slap in the face that made ears ring from California to New York. In Washington, a decision was made instantly that forever changed the lives of Americans. It was called M-Day, Mobilization Day. The government issued a decree that seems impossible in a free country today: a total ban on the production of civilian passenger cars. Think about these numbers. In 1941, American industry turned out 3 million brand new, chrome-gleaming cars. 3 million. Do you know how many civilian cars were produced during all the remaining years of the war, from 1942 to 1945? 139. Not thousand, not million. Just 139 units. And those were for government needs. It was the end of life as they knew it. Spare parts production stopped. Tires became worth their weight in gold. Gasoline, rationed. If your toaster broke, you couldn't buy a new one because the factory that made toasters was now making anti-aircraft shells. The company that sewed women's lingerie was now sewing camouflage nets. The typewriter manufacturer started assembling rifles. The entire country, like one giant mechanism, shifted gears. Chrysler no longer made luxury sedans. It started building tanks. General Motors turned into the main supplier of machine guns. But the most ambitious, craziest, and riskiest project was the idea of old Henry Ford. He looked at the heavy B-24 Liberator bomber, a complex machine consisting of hundreds of thousands of parts, and said, "I will make them like my Model Ts on an assembly line." Experts told him it was physically impossible. The bomber was too big, too complex. It couldn't be moved along a line. Knudsen approved the project, and so began the construction of the factory that was destined to become Hermann Göring's ultimate nightmare. Willow Run. Even the name sounded peaceful. Willow Run. But what appeared on the site of that creek was the deadliest industrial facility in human history. To understand the scale, forget everything you know about factories. Willow Run wasn't just a building. It was a city under one roof. The main assembly hall was a mile long, 1,500 meters of continuous floor. It took workers half an hour of brisk walking just to get from the entrance to their workstation. Many used bicycles or roller skates to move around inside the plant. The factory floor area was larger than Detroit's pre-war airport, including all its hangars and runways. It was the largest room in the world. The architect of this madness was Charles Sorensen, nicknamed Cast Iron Charlie, Henry Ford's right-hand man, a man who had steel wire instead of nerves. When he first sketched the factory plan with a pencil on a hotel napkin, engineers looked at him like he was crazy. They said, "Charlie, this is a swamp. This is a forest. It will take years to build this." Sorensen looked at them and uttered the phrase that became the motto of the entire construction. "Just pour the concrete. We'll figure out the roof later." And they started pouring. In winter. In freezing temperatures. They burned huge bonfires to keep the ground from freezing and laid the foundation right into the mud. The factory grew faster than the Nazis could capture cities in Europe. But building the walls was half the battle. The real magic happened inside. Remember the problem? A plane isn't a car. The B-24 Liberator consisted of 450,000 parts. 30,000 of them were unique components. 300,000 rivets. Previously, such planes were assembled by a crew of craftsmen crawling around the fuselage like ants for weeks. Ford and Sorensen flipped the script. They broke the plane into pieces. They stopped building the whole plane. Instead, one group of workers made only the nose. Another, only the tail. A third, the wings. Giant presses as high as a 3-story building stamped out wing parts, just like they stamped fenders for the Ford V8. It was an L-shaped assembly line. At the start of the line, it was just sheets of aluminum. As they moved, they sprouted wires, tubes, instruments. At the end of the line, giant cranes lifted the finished sections, wings, fuselage, cockpit, and joined them together with frightening precision. Skeptics said, "Aluminum is soft. The dies will tear it." Ford made dies from a special alloy. Skeptics said, "You can't teach farmers to assemble bombers." Ford broke the process down into the simplest operations that even a child could handle. And then came the moment of truth. The factory reached its design capacity. Imagine the rhythm. 1 a.m., the hangar doors open. A brand new B-24, smelling of paint and grease, rolls onto the runway. Engines roar. The pilot gives a thumbs up. The plane flies off to war. 63 minutes pass. The doors open again. The second bomber. Another 63 minutes. The third. 24 hours a day. 7 days a week. No holidays. No weekends. Every 63 minutes, America gave birth to 30 tons of death for the Third Reich. The Germans couldn't believe it. Their intelligence reported the numbers from Willow Run to Hitler, and the Führer declared these reports Jewish American propaganda. He believed it was physically impossible to produce such complex machines at such speed. He thought the Americans were just repainting the same planes and flying them in circles. But it wasn't propaganda. It was the mathematics of mass production, raised to the absolute. However, this metal monster had an insatiable appetite. It needed not only aluminum and rubber, it needed human flesh. Someone had to stand at those machines, and the men, the very men who usually worked in factories, had gone to the front. The solution to the labor shortage became the greatest social revolution in American history. When the men left for the front, factories began hunting for those whom managers previously wouldn't even let in the door. First came the women. We've all seen the poster, Rosie the Riveter, a girl in a bandana showing her bicep. We are used to seeing this as a glossy image, but the reality was far from glamorous. A riveter's job is hellish physical labor. A pneumatic hammer weighs several kilograms. When it works, the vibration is so intense, your teeth chatter and your arms go numb to the shoulders. And you do this for 8, 10, 12 hours straight. Yesterday's housewives, secretaries, and waitresses took off their heels, put on heavy boots, and stepped up to the presses. They cut their long hair or hid it under tight scarves, not for fashion, but for survival. Static electricity from a rotating shaft could pull hair into the mechanism and scalp a person in a split second. This changed the very face of American cities. Trains from the South poured into Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. African Americans, who had been locked in a system of segregation and poverty for decades, were suddenly in demand. Racial prejudices didn't disappear, but the need for hands was stronger than hate. The factory floor became the first place in America where black and white worked shoulder to shoulder for a single goal. They took everyone. The deaf worked in shops where the noise drove hearing people mad. The blind sorted small parts by touch, at speeds cited, people couldn't match. Dwarfs climbed into the narrow tails of bombers to secure wiring where a normal-sized person couldn't reach. Life in industrial centers turned into an endless conveyor belt. There were so many people and so little housing that the hot bunk system appeared. In boarding houses, the same bed was rented to 3 different people. One got up and went to a shift. The second immediately lay down on the still warm pillow. People even had to sleep in 24-hour movie theaters. But the most amazing thing was not how they worked, but why. Every worker at a machine had a personal reason to be there. For the woman drilling holes in a P-51 fighter wing, her husband might be a Marine on Guadalcanal. For the old man turning a shell casing, his grandson might be flying that very B-17 over Germany. There is a famous story about an inspector at a plant discovering writing inside the casing of an aerial bomb. Workers would chalk messages to Hitler and Tojo, but one message was not addressed to the enemy. A woman had written on the fuse her husband's name and a short phrase, "I made this so you can come home." This was an army in blue overalls. They didn't get medals. They often ruined their health inhaling welding fumes and asbestos dust. But they created something no Nazi strategist had accounted for. They created the human factor in mass production. Every part was made by the hands of people who hated the enemy just as much as the soldiers on the front lines. The American worker knew, if he did a sloppy job, his neighbor might not come back. And while America forged the sword of victory with the hands of free people driven by patriotism and love, a very different system was operating in Europe. A system built on fear, the whip, and barbed wire. There is a myth about German efficiency. We are used to thinking of the Nazi war machine as a flawless mechanism where everything works like a Swiss watch. But if you looked inside German factories of the early 40s, you would see not an assembly line, but a craftsman's workshop blown up to grotesque proportions. Germany's problem was their engineers. They were too good. The German engineering school was obsessed with perfection. For them, a Tiger tank or a Messerschmitt fighter wasn't just a weapon. It was a work of technical art. Every detail had to be perfect. Weld seams were polished to a mirror shine, even if no one would ever see them. Engines were tuned individually. This sounded beautiful in theory, but in practice, it was suicide. In the US, if a piston didn't fit into a cylinder, the worker threw it in the scrap bin and took a new one. In Germany, if a part didn't fit, a highly skilled master took a file and manually adjusted it until it fit perfectly. As a result, every German tank was slightly unique. You couldn't just take a gearbox from one knocked-out Tiger and put it in another. They might not match by a fraction of a millimeter. An American mechanic could fix a Sherman in the field with a sledgehammer and parts from a neighboring tank. A German mechanic needed a factory workshop and a surgeon's set of tools. And here is the statistic that explains everything. In the middle of the war, while a German master was using a magnifying glass to check the polish quality of one part, 3 finished planes were rolling off the line in Michigan. But there was a problem even scarier than perfectionism: constant interference. Hitler and his generals treated production like a construction set. They constantly demanded improvements. Let's put a bigger gun on it. Let's add armor. Let's change the shape of the turret. For a factory, any such change is a catastrophe. You have to stop the line, change the machines, retrain the people. Americans froze the design of their tanks and planes. The Sherman wasn't a perfect tank, but there were many of them. The Germans, however, spawned endless modifications. They had so many versions of equipment that logistics for spare parts turned into a nightmare. Field warehouses were bursting with parts, but none of them fit the machines sitting in repair. By 1944, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, tried to copy the American system. He tried to introduce standardization, but it was too late. And besides, Nazi industry had a rotten foundation that could not be fixed. Slave labor. Millions of people herded from all over Europe. POWs, concentration camp prisoners, Osterbiters. The Nazis thought free labor was their advantage. It was their fatal mistake. A slave doesn't want to work. A slave wants to survive and, if lucky, harm the master. The quality of German equipment began to fall, not just because of bombings. It fell because of quiet, invisible sabotage. A screw not fully tightened, a pinch of sand in the oil, a poorly soldered contact in a radio that would fall off at the first shake in battle. An American worker in Detroit knew if he made a defect, he would be fired, and his son at the front might die. A concentration camp prisoner knew if he made a defect so the guard didn't notice, it would be his personal contribution to the victory over his tormentors. American industry ran on fuel made of patriotism, high wages, and caffeine. The German machine tried to run on fear and hunger, and in a long race, fear always loses. By 1944, this difference became obvious. German aces were still dangerous. Their jet planes were technological miracles. But when they looked into the sky, they didn't see individual enemy planes. They saw the mathematical impossibility of their victory. The calendar read February 20th, 1944. In Allied Air Force headquarters, this date was circled in red marker. The operation was codenamed Argument, but history remembers it by another name, Big Week. It was at this moment that the dam Knudsen and Ford had been building for 3 years finally burst. Early in the morning, the air over England trembled. It wasn't wind. It was the sound of thousands of engines starting simultaneously. An armada rose from the airfields, the likes of which the world had never seen. Not 100 planes. Not 200. More than 3,000 heavy bombers and fighters took to the sky. Their goal was simple and brutal. General Henry Arnold decided to stop playing cat and mouse. He ordered the bombing of German aircraft factories. The goal wasn't just to destroy buildings. The goal was to lure the Luftwaffe into the sky, to force German aces to rise and defend their homes and destroy them there. It was a trap, and the giant flying fortresses served as bait. German pilots accepted the challenge. They were used to fighting. They knew American tactics. Usually, escort fighters flew to the German border and, running low on fuel, turned back. After that, the bombers remained defenseless, like a flock of sheep before wolves. Nazi aces in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs took positions, waiting for the moment the American fighters turned home. But this time, something happened that made the blood run cold in the veins of German pilots. The American fighters didn't turn back. These were the new P-51 Mustangs, sleek, predatory machines with shiny aluminum sides. And most importantly, they had extra fuel tanks hanging under their wings. These Mustangs could fly to Berlin, circle the Reichstag, and return to London. Suddenly, the hunters became the prey. German interceptors, heavy with armor and cannons for fighting bombers, found themselves one-on-one with nimble, fast Mustangs that were simply obscenely numerous. The sky over Europe turned into a meat grinder. From the ground, it looked like a chaotic dance of contrails. Burning aluminum fell like rain. In one big week, Americans dropped as many bombs on the German aviation industry as they had in the entire previous year. But the main result wasn't destroyed workshops. Machines can be fixed. Walls can be rebuilt. The main result was the destruction of pilots. The Luftwaffe lost a third of its combat strength in a single week. A third. The most experienced aces, veterans who survived France and Russia, died in burning cockpits or hung in parachutes. watching endless squadrons with white stars on their wings fly past. Americans took losses too. Terrible losses. Hundreds of planes didn't return to base. But this is where the math of Detroit kicked in. When a German colonel looked at the casualty list, he understood. Replacing a shot-down Messerschmitt would be hard, but replacing the pilot Hans, who had been flying since 1939, was impossible. When an American general looked at the losses, he simply picked up the phone. The next morning, new planes, gleaming with factory grease, landed on airfields in England, and new pilots disembarked from transports, young guys from Iowa and Texas who had passed accelerated courses. It was the assembly line of war. America turned aerial combat into an equation of resources. You shot down 10 of our planes. Fine. 20 will arrive tomorrow. Shot down 20? 50 will arrive. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Germany darkened. Luftwaffe pilots called it the aluminum overcast. Wherever they looked, west, east, south, there were American planes everywhere. There were so many that air traffic controllers had to separate them by altitude so bombers wouldn't collide with each other in the air. It was a complete, absolute humiliation of the Nazi doctrine of quality. What good is your skill if 12 enemies attack you alone? It was during these days, looking out the window of his train somewhere near Berlin, that Hermann Göring saw fighters over the Reich capital. At first, he thought they were his own, but then he made out the silhouettes. They were Mustangs. Later, in captivity, he would admit, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." But Hitler had one last hope remaining. Weapons of vengeance. Technology that was 10 years ahead of its time, and which, according to the Nazis' plan, was supposed to sweep this aluminum swarm from the sky. In the summer of 1944, American pilots began returning to base with stories that sounded like the ravings of a madman. They reported German planes without propellers, machines that flew at the speed of sound, leaving a trail of black smoke, and vanished into the clouds before a bomber gunner could even turn his turret. Intelligence confirmed the worst fears. The Nazis had introduced the Messerschmitt, Me 262, Schwalbe, Swallow, into combat. The world's first operational jet fighter. It wasn't just a new weapon. It was a leap across a generation. A Mustang could reach 700 kilometers per hour at its limit, its engine roaring with strain. The German Swallow easily did 870. It was armed with 4 30mm cannons. A single burst was enough to tear a B-17 in half. In a fair one-on-one fight, a piston plane had no chance against a jet. It was like a knight with a sword facing a soldier with a machine gun. It seemed Göring's nightmare had receded. Germany had a Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon. Technically, they had won. They had outpaced time. But then, the ruthless logic of attrition warfare imposed by the U.S. came into play. First, the Swallow appeared too late. And do you know who is to blame? Hitler again. When he was shown the prototype fighter, he asked, "Can it carry bombs?" The engineers turned pale. They tried to explain it was an interceptor, but the Führer stomped his foot. He wanted a blitz bomber. As a result, precious months were lost redesigning the structure, which worsened the plane's performance. Second, technology collided with the reality of production. The Jumo jet engines were temperamental monsters. Due to a shortage of rare metals, which Germany could no longer import because of the naval blockade, turbine blades were made of cheap steel. The result? The engine burned out after 10, maximum 25 hours of operation. Imagine that. After every few sorties, the plane needed a complete engine replacement. This is a logistical nightmare, even in peacetime. But in conditions where American bombers were wiping German factories off the face of the earth, it was a death sentence. And this is where our microhook worked. In 1944, the situation looked like this. The Germans had the best engineers and blueprints from the future. The Americans had boring old logistics. but the Germans had jet planes sitting on the ground because they had nothing to refuel them with and nothing to fix them with. The Americans had an endless sea of high-octane gasoline and mountains of spare parts. The genius lost to the supply manager. American pilots quickly figured out how to fight the swallows. They didn't engage them in dogfights. They used rat-catching tactics. A jet plane needs a lot of time to take off and slow down. At the moment of takeoff and landing, it is as helpless as a baby. Mustangs simply hung over German airfields. They waited. As soon as a swallow touched the runway or tried to take off, a flock of Mustangs would dive on it and shoot it up on the ground. It wasn't chivalry. It was a beating. In one battle, a group of Me-262s shot down several American bombers. The German pilots returned as heroes. But while they were celebrating, the radio announced that on that same day, Ford's factories had turned out another 50 new B-24s. German ace Adolf Galland, commander of the fighter force, later said, "It was like trying to stop ants by stepping on them. You kill 100, but 1,000 more crawl out of the anthill." By April 1945, the most advanced planes in human history stood abandoned along the autobahns. They were out of kerosene. The pilots were out of hope. And in the sky above them droned an endless stream of aluminum machines with white stars. America's industrial power didn't just defeat technology, it made it irrelevant. The best tanker plane isn't the one with the thickest armor or highest speed. It's the one that can actually make it to the battlefield. May 8th, 1945. Austria. A road near the city of Kitzbühel. A strange column moves along the highway. These are not tanks or military trucks. It is a motorcade of luxurious Mercedes cars. Inside sits a man dressed in a specially tailored gray-blue uniform, hung so thick with metals they jingle with every move. Hermann Göring, once the second most powerful man in the Reich, is going to surrender. Even at this moment, he remained himself. He brought with him 17 trucks of personal belongings, champagne, and caviar. He expected the Americans to meet him as an equal, like a knight who lost a tournament. He thought he would drink cognac with General Eisenhower and discuss the strategy of gentlemanly warfare. But when the motorcade stopped, he wasn't met by generals. He was surrounded by simple soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division of the Texas Army. Guys from the very towns where soup lines stood just 5 years ago. They looked at this corpulent man in white gloves not with admiration, but with disgust. To them, he wasn't a Reichsmarschall, but a war criminal. He was stripped of all ranks. His marshal's baton was taken away, and instead of a palace, he was placed in an ordinary interrogation cell in Camp Ashkan. It was there, in that gray room, that the conversation took place, which summarized our entire story. American intelligence officers and journalists asked him questions. They asked about Hitler, about strategy, about mistakes. Göring answered evasively, trying to shift the blame to others. But at one point, the topic turned to the reasons for the defeat, to why the Luftwaffe, the strongest air force in the world, disappeared from the skies. Göring sighed heavily. The arrogance fell away from him. Before the interrogators sat a tired, broken old man. He looked into the eyes of an American officer and said something that crossed out his laughter from 5 years ago. "The Allies owe their air superiority to their industry," he said. He continued, and every word was an admission of the genius of the very people he had despised. "American production exceeded my worst fears. I never thought it was possible to produce such quantities of equipment with such speed." At that moment, the circle closed. The man who in 1940 laughed at refrigerator manufacturers was now a prisoner of those manufacturers. He saw with his own eyes what he had refused to believe. He saw jeeps, thousands of jeeps. He saw Studebaker trucks stretching in endless columns to the horizon. He saw American soldiers throwing away half-empty packs of cigarettes and opening new ones, while German soldiers picked cigarette butts off the ground. he saw the material embodiment of American power. Göring admitted that the turning point for him was not Stalingrad and not Normandy. It was the very day he saw American fighters over Berlin. "When I saw Mustangs over the Reichstag, I knew the war was lost," he said. "This was a victory not just for soldiers. It was a victory for William Knudsen, who worked for $1. A victory for cast-iron Charlie Sorensen, who poured concrete into the mud. A victory for millions of women with riveting hammers. Nazi Germany bet on will, fanaticism, and wonder weapons. America bet on logistics, mass volume, and the standard interchangeable part." In that interrogation cell, Göring finally understood the truth Detroit had always known. In modern war, the winner isn't the one with the most beautiful sword. The winner is the one who can bring 10,000 swords to the battle. And if one breaks, simply grab a new one from the box. His laughter in 1940 was the laughter of an aristocrat at a merchant. His silence in 1945 was the silence of a man crushed by the steamroller of industrial progress. When the guns fell silent and the ink dried on the surrender documents, another miracle occurred. This time, a peaceful one. In the blink of an eye, the arsenal of democracy turned into the arsenal of prosperity. The same factories that stamped out Sherman tanks changed dies and began churning out tractors and family station wagons. Lines that assembled aircraft engines began assembling washing machines. William Knudsen, the dollar-a-year man, completed his mission. He returned to Detroit. His health was broken by the endless stress of the war years, and he passed away in 1948. He didn't receive the Medal of Honor like the generals, but if you look at modern America, you see his monument everywhere. It's in every highway, in every suburb, in the very idea of the American middle class. The money the government poured into industry and the wages Rosie the Riveters received ended the Great Depression once and for all. Skills learned assembling bombers allowed for the construction of civil aviation that connected the whole world. But the story of how American industry punished the Nazis leaves us with one important lesson, a lesson that is relevant today. Hermann Göring made the classic dictator's mistake. He confused a peaceful way of life with weakness. He looked at Americans and saw a nation of merchants, farmers, and consumers. He saw people who argue in Congress, strike at factories, and love comfort. He thought democracy was chaos that could not withstand the iron discipline of totalitarianism. Laughing at Roosevelt's plan, he missed the main point. Refrigerators, cars, and toasters are not a sign of weakness. They are a sign of incredible, hidden power. Because a country that can provide a refrigerator for every family possesses the production capacity, logistics, and engineering genius to create the most terrifying war machine in history. It only needs a reason to flip the switch. Göring was right about one thing. Americans really do love their refrigerators. But he didn't account for the fact that the same hands that create comfort are capable of squeezing the throat of tyranny with the force of a hydraulic press. In the end, history judged their dispute brutally, but fairly. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years and left behind only ruins and shame. And the impossible 50,000 planes became a reality. In total, during the war, the U.S. produced 295,959 aircraft. This number is not just a statistic. It is the tombstone on the grave of Nazi arrogance. And somewhere in the archives of history, if you listen closely, you can still hear that laughter of Hermann Göring from 1940. But now it sounds very different. Now it is not the laugh of a winner. It is the nervous laughter of a man who just realized he woke a sleeping giant and watched the giant open its eyes.